Hello, my name is Denise Luneman, and I'm one of the members here at Desert Grace. I'm excited to share this Sunday message with you. Would you take a moment right now to subscribe to our channel? And if you like this video, be sure to give us a thumbs up so that we know you've been blessed. You can do those things below.
Are we having fun yet? Some of you. Some of you. That's good. That's good. Some of you ought to be having fun. Some of you are probably still a little conflicted. That's all right. That's all right, right? We've been talking a lot about the idea that there is conflict in the world, right? And that we are part of that conflict, and that there's a number of things that are in a part of that. And in the midst of all that, there's also this idea of reconciliation. That in the midst of whatever conflict you might happen to discover, there's also the idea that there's reconciliation, that things should be reconciled. We started out with the root of all conflict, which is our all-out war against God. That we chose to sort of go against God and say that we would like to be like God. In essence, that we want to be worshipped as little g gods and little g goddesses, and that's part of our initial problem. And that without kind of getting that where it needs to go, we'll be stuck forever in a cycle of conflict that we will never be able to break. So hopefully you've gotten that one taken care of, because God is the one who provides the reconciliation. We defined reconciliation as friendship and harmony, so that when we were once enemies in an all-out war against God, we now get to be friends with Him and live in harmony with Him once again. Oh, it's good preaching. We could stop there, but we won't. After that, he calls us to be ambassadors of this reconciliation, ambassadors of Christ, going out and taking this message to others who also need to be reconciled with God. And he says, guess what? This is totally awesome. He picks you to be one of those ambassadors. I know you've been really excited about this. That we should be people who see others through the eyes of the God who sends us out to be a part of the world around us. We talked about how conflict often happens over matters of pride, sort of the conceited pride, the pride that puts us above other people. And that we need to make sure that we have a healthy pride, which is the pride that goes along with being able to say, I am one of God's children. I am one of His ambassadors. I have signed the peace treaty, right? And now He needs me and uses me to make a difference in the world around me. That's really exciting, you guys. You really ought to. So anyway, the second thing we've been talking about as a cause of thing is a need to control. And here's something I want to just bring to your attention. The fight or flight response is literally a person who is out of control. The fight or flight response that we get when we are worried is this sort of like animal nature that begins to take over. We do not really control it. It's just something that we got to pay attention to. It's actually a physiological response to any event which we think might be a threat. Might, right? So that if you are going for a donut, you see that there's only one donut left out there on the table, then everyone else who seems to be walking toward that table becomes a threat. Will you fight or will you flight? Will you flee and just go buy your own dozen of donuts? Right? That's it. The point is that this response is involuntary. One of the problems that we sometimes run into is that we ourselves sometimes get a little bit frightened when we knew something was coming. Like you know at the beginning of the race, the track race, that they're going to shoot the gun and it's going to make a loud noise. And you still respond with a fight or flight even though you knew it was coming because you want to make sure it is safe. And so if somebody's looking at you and they're looking a little angry, the fight or flight just kicks right in. We don't get to pick that. It just happens. Again, we are either going to choose, we're going to run away, right? I don't want to fight you, so I'll see you later. Or we're going to go into battle with our sword drawn, ready to take out whoever we need to take out, because that's what we're going to do. There's a third sort of thing that's sort of been added into this equation, and it's the freeze part of fight or flight. So it's freeze, fight, or flight. And some experts will say that freeze can be seen in two separate ways, but that initially, almost every time when we get this particular reaction, our first thing to do is to stop and evaluate. And in a millisecond, we are going through all of our memories of a similar event to see if this is safe or is it not safe. And then we make a decision. Some people don't make a decision. They just freeze. Play dead. Right? I don't know what to do. I'll just stand here. Right? They also say that this freeze could be part of a progression. That actually your first thing is that you will freeze and you will stop and you will evaluate. That may take a second or less. Then you'll try to run away. And when you realize that the best thing to do is to stay and fight, you move on to the fight. So those are some things. I want you to know this, that all conflict begins as a freeze, fight, or flight response. Every single conflict that we find ourselves in is some sort of threat that we perceive. And by the way, I'm just going to lay this out on the line. It's something that we perceive is going to harm us. Okay? We are not so concerned if it's going to harm somebody over there in another church, right? If they, we're concerned about them, but we're not going to go into fight, flight, or freeze over something that's going on what we can't even see. We don't usually enter a conflict voluntarily. We don't usually think it through because it is an emotional response. When was the last time you sat down and you said, you know what I think I want to do today? I'm going to go get into some conflict with somebody. Where could I go get in some conflict with somebody? Well, there's always the grocery store. I could take my cart and go hit everybody on the back of the shin there. That'll cause some conflict. I could cut some people off in traffic, see how far I can get with that. I could call my wife and blame her for everything that's gone wrong since we got married a few years ago. But I don't ever remember waking up in the morning and saying, you know what, I think today is a good day to be upset and kick the dog. I hope you've never done that. But the reality is that this response that's sort of involuntary causes us to get into conflicts and causes those conflicts to escalate in ways we would have never intended if we weren't thinking out of a part of our brain that God needs to get a hold of. I want you to imagine for a minute that you're spending time and you have just spent about 3 years with the guy that you are convinced is the Messiah. The one that had been promised in all of the old prophecies. And this guy came on the scene and he walked up to you and he said, hey, I got an idea. You might be a fisherman now, but why don't you come over and leave everything behind and follow me? And you said, you know what? Sounds fun. I'm kind of tired of smelling fish all the time. And sales haven't been that good lately or whatever. No, they just followed him. That's all we know. But you've spent 3 years. Now, in these 3 years, you have seen some incredible things happen, right? You have seen healings. You have seen people who were out of their mind become normal. right? You have seen people who could not walk get up and run. You have seen all kinds of things, and you have heard so many things about how God is supposed to be like. And so you have all these things, and maybe you don't understand every bit of it, but you have spent 3 years with this person, day in, day out. You've prayed together, you've eaten together, you've gone everywhere together. He sent you out to see what you can do and take his message around. And then all of a sudden, somebody shows up to arrest him. What is your response? Guess this must be God's plan. I guess I'll call a lawyer. See ya. We know at least one response, right? Peter goes, I know what I'm going to do. Whoosh, take off that ear. Don't know if Peter was just not used to working a sword and was trying for something greater. The reality is that we sometimes end up out of control because when things come down, we don't usually take the time to stop and consider all sides or to consider what might be going on. It's hard to be an ambassador of God when you are out of control. And especially if you are out of control and expect other people to conform to what you want. What you think ought to happen. Question for today: what is the model set by Jesus for resolving conflict? I've told you that our conflict resolution model it's outdated. It doesn't work well because it's dependent on other people coming up and saying, you know what? In this conflict that we had together, it was all my fault. You did nothing wrong. I should never have done the thing I did to you. Can I grovel at your feet for the next 5 days and you forgive me so that we can be reconciled to one another? And then after that, I will treat you however you wish to be treated. Even if it means it's really uncomfortable to me, or even if it's not really a healthy way. This is what we kind of expect people to do for us. Instead of us going, you know what? It's silly to be angry at somebody that you've known for a long, long time over something simple just because our fight, flight, and freeze response took over and we said something we shouldn't have said. What does Jesus show us? I want to make sure we get this because Jesus is going to say some really radical statements. And in fact, if you've ever studied through Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and you've looked through the idea of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has all these things he says. And a lot of them start out sort of like this, right? You have heard it said, but I say. You have heard it said, oh, this is all you got to do. But I'm telling you, you have to go way further. These are really radical things that Jesus has to say. And some of them cause us a lot of concern. Because when we read them, we go, now wait a minute. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like something we ought to do. So that's the best place for us to start, right? So here we go, Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. This says this: you have heard it said that eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, go ahead and turn him the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Speaking of which, I need a loan. Anybody? This passage refers to a concept known in the world as lex talionis. And basically, the idea is that the punishment needs to fit the crime. If somebody does something and it causes you to lose one of your eyes, then you shouldn't be able to then chop off their head. That it ought to be sort of similar. So the law of talion is about limits on revenge. So that when you're ready to get your justice, when you're ready to see that person pay for whatever they did to you, that there's a reasonable limit there, that you aren't now above and beyond where you ought to be, right? I think one of the problems with this is that when we think eye for eye and tooth for tooth, our first thought is what other people owe us. I don't think our first thought is what might I owe someone else. I know. I just turned it all around on you, and it was really fine until I said that, right? That's the way I feel about it. The maximum legal remedy when somebody who was doing something causes you to lose an eye is another eye. You can poke theirs out, or however that worked. I'm not really sure. I don't really want to talk too much about that, but the eyes and teeth are kind of important. If somebody causes you to lose an eye, you can only see half what you saw before. Trust me, I know, I lost an ear. I don't have my hearing aids in, so anybody over here, I can't hear you. This side, we're doing all right. That's why you guys need to amen twice as loud. Amen. There we go. Eyes and teeth are important. Without teeth, we can't have a way to eat the great things we like to eat, right? By Jesus' time, compensation was probably more likely in money, not in body parts. This has kind of continued on to today, right? We don't go into court and say, hey, look, you caused me to break my arm, so now it's my turn to get my revenge on you. I'm going to break your arm. It'll be fun, right? No, it's all about money. It's all about that. Just how much do you think an eyeball is worth? I did a little research for you so you would know how much an eyeball is worth. Your eyeball is worth about $1.6 million. In Arizona. I don't know about other states. There was an Arizona case in which a worker was standing on a ladder. He was working on something, and one of his co-workers came and pulled his leg a little bit, which caused him to react and fall and gouge out his eye. Now, they decided that he was 10% responsible because he should have been wearing eye protection. They decided that his company was 10% responsible because they should have made sure that nobody was being unsafe on the job site, and that the person who pulled the leg was 80% responsible, and awarded him $1.6 million. That's how much an eyeball is worth. The loss of a tooth or a number of teeth, the most I could find was $100,000. I don't know. I guess because they can replace those these days. Anyway, the law of Talion limits compensation. I want you to keep that in mind. It limits it. It is not a demand. It's merely a limit. It is not a this is what you have to do, so that if you lose an eye, you have to then turn around and get an eye worth back. So that becomes really important, because that means what Jesus is now saying is that might be the limit, but I'm giving you a new idea on how you should be looking at all of these other things. There's no requirement that you do anything if somebody wrongs you. And Jesus is sort of saying here, well, he's not sort of, he is saying here, when somebody does you wrong, I tell you, just let it be. I don't want to go too far with that, but I think the bottom line is that the punishment needs to fit the crime. And sometimes while we may have been hurt or we may have been injured, the point isn't to punish somebody else as much as it is maybe for us to be made whole. I think that's what Jesus would call us to do. Jesus says that there's a law that is more important than revenge. The problem really is that when somebody does us wrong, we don't sit around and go, oh, well, you know what? They might have had a bad day. Might have had a little issue here or there. And so, as long as whatever happens gets taken care of, we'll be fine. Normally, when somebody does something to us that injures us in any way, our first response is to say, you need to pay, and you might have scratched my car, but now you got to buy me a whole new one. And by the way, you've inconvenienced me, so you got to buy me dinner for a year, steak and lobster. Right? That tends to be the human response. Tends to be what we sort of say. Jesus says, don't resist an evil person. Don't resist when evil is done to you. Don't just try to fight your way. Don't repay evil with more evil. That essentially the idea is, can we be made whole? Can we find our way back? Are you ready for a little bit of a pride check? Because I got to tell you that the thing that goes on here is that so often we think, okay, we're out of control, but the reason we're out of control is that we're still struggling with the pride. It is still a problem for us. Here's some things that Jesus is saying, 4 little stories that he puts in here. And the first one says quite simply this: do not retaliate. Just don't do it. It's not important to do it. So if somebody slaps you, that's a pretty serious insult. Anybody really like being slapped? Of all the things that somebody might do to you, is slapping high on the list? Well, gee, I'd rather be slapped than have them call me a bad name. When somebody slaps us, when they hit us on the face, it's the most personal insult you could imagine. The most humiliating thing. And one of the things they talk about is that Matthew specifically talks about it as being a right cheek, which would suggest that if a right-handed person hits you on the right side of your face, that it's a backhanded slap, which is even more insulting, right? Here's the thing. It's an act of passion. I don't think anyone has ever sat and said, you know what? I'm really calm. Everything's going well. But you know what? That person over there just needs a good slap on the face. I'll do them the service and go do it. I don't think anyone has ever done that. You do it when you're angry. You do it when you're out of control. And by the way, if you do it to somebody who wants to be a little g god or goddess, they're going to be quite offended at your being a little g god or goddess. Because as we all know, we don't have a right to lay a hand on someone else unless we're somehow saving their life. Jesus says, when you turn the other cheek, that you should allow yourself to continue to be vulnerable to the person who has wronged you. Not to resist them, but to continue to be vulnerable to whatever is going on in your guys' shared life. That's a really radical position. Really radical. Because we have one result, right? And it's this. No one has the right to slap me. So if you slap me, I'm probably going to slap you back. Right? Well, I wouldn't. I'm really calm, and I would go to the rational parts of my brain and simply go, all right, can I have another? I wish. Second thing that Jesus speaks of is, if you should happen to be taken into court, give more than what is demanded. Don't just stop at what they're asking for. Give them some extra. Give them a little bit more. I think we can pretty much count on whatever lawsuit this happens to be that it's probably an unjust lawsuit. I don't think Jesus has in his mind the idea that you deserve to be taken to court and so you should just give twice as much. I don't think he had in mind that you had the slap coming to you either. I think what he has in mind is that we should have a different way of handling our differences. And in the midst of that if somebody takes you to court, you just go, you know what? If you need my tunic, my shirt, my coat more than I do, have it. Have it. It's okay. The idea of shirt and coat, by the way, that the NIV, the New Translation, shirt and coat, there's cloak and tunic, they're not always quite what we think in our minds today. So when you think of a shirt, a lot of you might be wearing a shirt today. A lot of you might be wearing some sort of a coat or an over whatever, a sweater or something like that. But the shirt and the idea of a tunic is actually the inner garment that goes directly against the skin. Not the boxers or briefs or whatever like we wear today, but the garment that is the closest inside. The coat is the robe or the cloak or the outer garment that keeps you warm, and in that time was really how you slept and stayed warm while you were sleeping. And so he's saying, look, if they ask you for your underwear, give them your coat and run around naked. That's literally kind of what he's saying. Here's the thing that's interesting about that. Legally, you could not win somebody's coat in court. It's an inalienable right. No one can ever take your cloak. Ever. And Jesus is saying if they take you to court where they could never get it, go, here it is. Enjoy it. That's the way we handle our differences these days. But back then, I guess things were different. Okay, maybe that's not how we handle problems. Person being sued willingly says, here, have it all. There's a subtle message in there, don't you think? The subtle message is that if we are going to be the people that God calls us to be, that we are going to be people who go above and beyond what the law requires, because we are going to be a radical people who show what God does for us. Because in all of these examples, who lived it out any better than Jesus himself? The idea is to just simply not resist, to seek a resolution to the conflict. So what is Jesus telling us about conflict resolution? Give up. We don't like that. We don't have. You see, the thing is, this is about a willingness. How far are we willing to go in order to resolve a conflict we have with someone else? Got awful quiet. How far are we willing to go? Jesus says we need to go the extra mile. Now, I understand this isn't like, hey, somebody comes and says, you know, I could really use some help. Would you walk with me for the next mile so I won't be so lonely? That's not the kind of going the extra mile. This is a forced service. This is something that somebody in authority says, you have to do this. And Jesus says, look, whatever you are asked to do, go beyond that. Be willing. Show them your willingness to serve them by going farther. And by the way, if you didn't catch this, nowhere in the passage does it say, if you do this, they'll come to know me. I wish it did. That would be nice. But it doesn't say that. It just says, do it this way. We typically equate this or talk about this as soldiers who are forcing someone to carry their gear for another mile. The Persian soldiers or whatever that were in that time, making them walk carry all their garbage for a mile. Jesus says, when you get to the end of that mile, say, hey, this is fun, let's do it again. Sort of. I think that we need to make sure we understand this can be any sort of demanded service. Not just if a soldier walks up to you and says, hey, you have to carry my pack. Think about Simon of Cyrene. You remember him? He shows up a little later in the book of Matthew. He shows up actually in the crucifixion narrative. When the soldiers say, hey, you, Simon, you carry his cross the next step of the way. You are the one who must do it. It's a forced service. And so if he sits there and goes, well, really? Did you have to pick me? I won't do it. I think the implication here is that Jesus is saying, not only should you just go ahead and walk that extra mile, smile while you do it. Recognize that you are reconciled to God. And in your reconciliation, you are now an ambassador of God. You can see this person through God's eyes. You can be God himself to this person. Now, I think there's a good chance that if you were to do these sorts of things, somebody would go, you are crazy. I forced you to go a mile. You turned to me and said, hey, that wasn't very far. Let's go again. Notice that we are all too willing to help somebody out as long as it's our idea. Now, this could or could not be a story from my own situation. Hypothetically speaking, of course. But have you ever thought, today will be the day that I'm going to go home from work a little early, and I think I'll vacuum because the house needs to be vacuumed, and maybe I'll go ahead and put dinner on so that my wife can come home from work and everything will be oh so wonderful, and she'll come home and she will tell me just how great of a husband that I am, even though I'm always a great husband, and she's going to tell me how wonderful it is. And all it takes is for her to call and go, hey, I'm going to run late tonight. Will you put on dinner? And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that. Guess it's pizza tonight. Pretty sure I'm going to have to work late too. That may or may not have ever happened in our house. I'm just telling you. But have you noticed that, kind of where it's, sometimes people like to go clean somebody else's house, but they don't like being forced to clean their own? Jesus is saying, don't be that way. He's saying, be joyful in anything you are forced to do. The fourth thing that he speaks of is to live generously. He says something that kind of makes me a little uncomfortable. Kind of something like, give to anyone who's in need, and don't refuse anybody who needs to borrow something. I'd like to put some qualifiers in that. If you've ever helped them out before and they've not repaid you some way, you shouldn't do it a second time. If you took a look at them and you're like, you know what? You're able to go get a job. Go down and apply. Then you shouldn't have to. Okay, I'd like to put those qualifiers in there. Jesus doesn't. He's basically saying, if you have the means to help somebody, just do it. Just do it. And don't worry about anything else. And don't worry about getting paid back. Don't worry about if you are loaning an item, whether or not you're going to get that item back. If you get it back, great. Praise God. If you don't get it back, go buy another. I think that's what Jesus is saying to us. I do know that it would end a lot of conflicts. Because if you have ever loaned a number of items to a number of people, trust me, something isn't coming back. Or something is coming back not the way you sent it. Have you ever lost a friend because they didn't return a tool? I've known people like this, where they stopped having conversations with one another. Why? Because one of them loaned another one a power tool, and it never came back. I don't know if they ever asked for it. I don't know anything like that. I just know that that ended a relationship. It's a power tool. Go down and get another. Be blessed. I think part of what Jesus is trying to say here is you need to look beyond the merit of the other person. I want to point something out here. This is the freeze, fight, flight response. When somebody you know says, "Can I borrow that item?" Or "Can I borrow some money?" we freeze and go, "What's my experience loaning that kind of item to anybody? What's my experience loaning anything to you?" And sometimes in the midst of that, our pride allows us to look down on whether or not someone deserves to be able to be blessed by us. It's hard stuff. Hard stuff. I don't think that we can give out of what we don't have available. Yeah? I don't think what Jesus is saying here is that anybody that ever asks you for money, just hand it over. If he is, I'll be standing at the door on the way out. That's 7 kids. I don't think that's what he's saying. I don't think he's telling us to just willy-nilly just sort of start handing out money or items to anyone who needs it. I don't think he's trying to get us to be broke and destitute. I don't think that that's where he's at. But I think that what he's saying is don't look down on people who ask for you before you've had the opportunity to get rid of the fight, flight, freeze response and see that you can help somebody. I think this is more about how we think about those who are asking than how we are able to help them or not help them. That when somebody comes up to you and somebody asks you a question, if your first thought is you won't even deserve to have half of what you have, then you have already broken what Jesus is speaking of here. Again, Jesus' instructions in this passage should be very shocking. Some of us have been in church for more than a year or two. Probably heard lots of sermons and been getting closer to God. And even then, we're still a little uncomfortable when we hear these sorts of things. And my point today is not to make you feel guilty. It's not what I'm trying to do. But I want to help us to all rethink the idea that sometimes we think we know how something is supposed to be, and then Jesus comes on the scene and he says, "Hey, if you are going to be part of who I am, let me show you how shocking this is going to be for you." Because if somebody slaps you, I want you to turn the other cheek. Here you go. If somebody requires you to walk a mile, I want you to go an extra mile. If somebody has done something to you, I don't want your first thought to be, how are you going to make this right? How will I get my revenge? That's a shocking thing, even in our world today. Notice that these stories have been qualified and interpreted by many scholars and preachers and everything else, and now you've heard mine, right? But I want to make sure that you understand something. I think there are some qualifications. I don't think that Jesus is saying you just write blank checks here. I don't think you turn the other cheek and then go, hey, can we come over for dinner? Or would you like to come over to my place where we'll have a barbecue? I don't know that he's going quite that far, but I also don't know that he isn't. But I did notice that in most of these things, what he's saying is stop being so concerned about your rights or what's yours. These stories contain Jesus' model for conflict resolution. That's good news. First, if we're going to resolve conflict, we follow Jesus in that he released all control. Did you notice that when Jesus is walking in the wilderness, that when Jesus is going through ministry, when everything that he does, what he always says, what he always does is say, I am following what the Father wants for me. I am not here of my own accord as much as I am an ambassador of the one who has sent me. And you have been called to be ambassadors. One of the reasons that we freeze, flee, and or fight is that we need to feel in control. If you would release that, it'll change your life. We need to feel, if we are going to be in control like our own little g gods and goddesses, and that others need to worship our needs, but if we will release that control, and when people come to us, we think of them first as though God is speaking through us or seeing through us, wouldn't that be a big difference in the way we see things? Jesus did. Jesus did. Easter's coming, y'all. It's coming. And he's not going to say, well, let me think about whether or not these people are worthy. Let me think. Are they going to pay me back for what I'm doing for them? What's in it for me? I'm not going to do it. Releasing control means that our response, our emotional response to what we perceive as an injustice against us will become something different. It will take a lot of that emotion out. I like to talk about when people cut you off in traffic because we've all done it to somebody else and we've all had it done to us. If you release control, that other people need to treat you exactly the way they need to treat you, you are going to see other people's actions through a whole new idea. You might even discover that that person that cut you off didn't mean to. I know, normally we don't get to talk to them unless they're like in front of you and turn into the church. Anyway. To resolve conflict, Jesus focused on others and not himself. He released control. And by the way, once you've released control, focusing on others instead of focusing on you is a whole lot easier because you're not so caught up and tied up and trying to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing for you. It's easy for us to be focused on others if we aren't so focused on ourselves that we are looking at others and going, all right, you look like you might be a friend, so maybe I can loan you my tool. But I better get it back or we are finished. I will never talk to you again. Releasing control actually releases us to see when others have success. How often do we get excited about others' success? Sometimes we're like jealous, right? Well, I should only speak for myself. Sometimes I get jealous. Other people have a brand new car. I don't. Sometimes we can see other people's failures and realize that they're hurting too. But sometimes when they make an error and that results in failure, and broken relationships and everything that comes with, that we would then see them in a whole new light. We would be able to see other people when they're happy and be happy with them. We'd see others when they're in pain and we would hurt with them. We got to lose control of ourselves, not be so tied up in that, and then focus on others. It's impossible to see others as God sees them if we are only looking at ourselves in a mirror. It's impossible. Jesus reminds us this is not about our rights. Shocking! But it's about our relationship to God. And we're supposed to live a little differently. Hopefully we do. You see, focusing on others lets us focus and see others as God sees them. And in the process, we become less and less important to ourselves. Third, to resolve conflict, Jesus simply reflected God's character. I wish there was a way I could stand before you and go, Jesus, yeah, sure, he was the Messiah, and okay, he was the Son of God, but I don't know that he can speak for God and everything, because there's some things in here I'd sort of like to asterisk and say, well, maybe. Because the demand on us is pretty intense. That's why y'all got so quiet. Right? But we are supposed to reflect God's character. That's our role as ambassadors. Not to go and do our own thing and go, oh, by the way, God sent me. He wouldn't behave anything like I behave, but he sent me. You want to know about him? Well, I can tell you about him, but I can't show you because I don't get that part. Way too hard to live up to God's standards to show you what God is like. It's not the role of an ambassador. It's not the role of what God wants us to do. We can't reflect God's character if we are in a self-centered conflict resolution model. In other words, the way we normally do it isn't God's way, because it is only concerned with us. It's only concerned with us. I've noticed that God never demands his rights by force or by law and say, hey, look, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If he did, we would be in a lot of trouble. Instead, he says, even though you couldn't reconcile with me, I come to you and I give you the gift of reconciliation. I've come to the conclusion that the biggest challenge in reflecting God's character is one small two-letter word. It's us. We have a hard time. We are the challenge because we are too busy responding out of that involuntary fight, flight, flee instead of saying, wait. What does God want me to do as his ambassador? I got the impression that God never finds himself in this sort of mode. That he always is cool, calm, collected, even in the face of a group of people who tend to wander away from him and sometimes outright disrespect him, even though he sent his son to die for us. We got to be careful about this. If we are ever going to be good at resolving conflict and avoiding conflict, we are going to have to follow Jesus' way. And the good news is that it's easy. You were supposed to amen. All right. Okay, it's not easy. The good news is that God is with us. And we can be praying for him to show us what he wants us to do. If we could eliminate our automatic responses and let God take over, what would happen to our world? It'd be heaven, right? It'd be heaven. How are you going to resolve conflict? You're going to have some. I don't know what kind of conflict you'll have, but you'll have it. Some of you might have an issue because you're about to figure out where you're going for lunch. Or who's paying the bill? We better resolve conflict the way God calls us to resolve it. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. This isn't necessarily easy stuff to talk about. It isn't necessarily the kind of thing that we gather together and walk out going, gee, this was just so much fun this morning. But I'm sincere in hoping that no one here this morning just simply feels guilty, but that we feel challenged by the words that you've given us. That we should be working hard not to be a people of conflict, not to be people who reflect the world in our conflict, but to be people who truly do what you have called us to do. To be people who try our best to reflect your character and to be the ambassadors that you've called us to be. Lord, as we leave this place, help us to keep all of this in mind. Keep us safe till we have the opportunity to worship together once again. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for watching this sermon with me. If you enjoyed your time with us, we'd invite you to join us in person for a service. Visit us at desertgrace.org or give us a call at 928-305-1132 for more information.